A lot of times when I try to present the gospel to people, they jump. They have a ready reaction and jump immediately, knee-jerk reaction, to James. What about this? Well, let's finish what I'm talking about. No. They want to go to James chapter 2. Faith without works is dead. And that's their idea. You don't do any works, you ain't got no salvation. Well, all right, we have to go there sometimes. You have to do your homework ahead of time. Faith without works is dead. Faith alone, Paul teaches, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, lest any man should boast. Well, what about that? Well, let's go with faith without works is dead. So Paul is wrong. Let's trash and go to James. Faith without works is dead. And it speaks of this. Faith without works will not save one from an early physical death. A believer who does not do what the implanted word says, who does not lay aside all filthiness and abundance of evil as acceptable behavior, wherein sin has become full grown in him, has no works. Faith without works will not be saved from early physical death. Now, that's not what I think it says. I don't think you're saved at all, because the saved means eternal life. Well, when you put money in your bank, did you get eternal life? When you saved yourself a lot of hard work by doing it the hard way, did you get eternal life? Did Saul have a problem with David? And David prayed to the Lord for salvation from Saul throwing a spear at him, because they were rivals in battle. Who had the most kills? Wow. I mean, is that salvation unto eternal life? So the word saved can mean any number of things. Most of the time in the Bible it does not refer to having eternal life, because there are a lot more opportunities in this temporal life to save the value of your works, save you from extra work, save your soul in the sense of the resources that you have in this temporal life. So, let's take a look. Therefore, having laid aside all filthiness and overflow of evil, and receive with meekness, humble obedience, the implanted word which is able to save your souls. Do not merely listen to the words and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? That's what they want to talk about. Well, of course, we're in chapter 2 now. What are we doing about chapter 1? Let's go back and see what chapter 1 says. Because James chapter 2 has a chapter 1 before it. So let's go back to 2 to 1:18. And see what it says. 1:18. Of his own will, he, God, brought us forth, gave us birth, by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures, of all he created with a view to assurance of eternal life. Sounds like doing works? No. God brought us forth, gave us birth, by the virtue of the word of truth, which is the gospel. Then say, then we are complying with what he's asking you to do. Well, actually he's complying with you to believe. Note that the words rendered he brought us forth in the Greek is EXCLUSION, aorist tense, from the Greek word apakoio, meaning to give birth to, is the same verb used in the present tense in verse 15, rendered gives birth to death. Hence we are looking at a second birth given to an individual who has already experienced physical birth, this second birth coming solely out of a decision of God's as a gift to one who is a brother, a believer. So, St. Hodges in his work, the readers should never charge God with tempting them, since temptation has its fruit in sin and death. Such results cannot be God's work, and the readers would be deceived if they thought so. Instead, every excellent gift is what God bestows, and the supreme example of this is the new life, in contrast with death, which he has granted to us, verses 17 to 18. Indeed, God's gift of life to us is a foretaste of the world to come. So if James' readers love God, this is how they will view things during their times of trial. So it's already presumed that you have eternal life, and you did it as a gift, not by any works. Works and gift. Grace and works. Mutually exclusive. It's either by grace or it's by works, but it's not by grace plus works. Expositor says, James advances his final reason for denying that God is the author of temptation. Rather than acting destructively, God acts constructively. He chose to give us, believers, birth. We continue to look at this. Of his own will, verse 18. Since it is evident that not all men become believers, then God evidently chose exclusively of his own will, not dependent upon anything or anyone else, before all things, certain ones from amongst humanity to be given the free gift of this second birth. These are those who evidence this choice when they choose to become believers, to give them the good and perfect gift of spiritual birth. Where are their works here, see? Evidently this occurs when they become believers. So, second birth into eternal life salvation given as a gift by God, solely out of the will of God, to believers through the word of truth. The Bible, faith alone in what the word of truth presents to man on this matter, is what results in the second birth, to the exclusion of man's will and any human doing. So when we get to chapter 2, and we do relative to the subject of works, we already are beneficiaries of the second birth, of having eternal life, our salvation into eternal life, before we even consider doing works. Every good and perfect gift is from above. Of his own will he brought us forth, gave us birth by the word of truth. Bringing this home. Information from the word of truth, the Bible, specifically the gospel, when acted upon by an individual without any works. It doesn't say works there. It says by a moment of faith, as a gift. You can't do anything for it, because then that would be reward. It's a gift. If by a moment of faith results in him becoming a believer, which then solely by God's deliberate choice of his having exercised his will, not ours but his, provides him with a second birth, a spiritual one, eternal life, as a gift. This James 1:17. This rules out the physical birth in view of the fact that one must already be physically alive in order to believe in the word of truth. As some would say, well, that's talking about the physical birth. Evidently, this points to simply trusting in what the word of truth says about the second birth into eternal life, i.e., the gospel, to the exclusion of man's will or any contribution by man. Otherwise, this would contradict the stipulation that the second birth is a gift by the will of God. Notice that it is the will of man to choose to believe in this gospel and receive the free gift of eternal life, but it is solely by the will of God to offer and provide that gift. Okay, so are we established in chapter 1? I'd like to go through chapter 1 and belabor it, but that'll take weeks. So let's get that established. Do your own homework on chapter 1 and see if this does not bear out. So let's move back to 2:14, the culprit of cherry-picking people who aren't believers. Let's take a look at 2:14. So we went all the way through chapter 2. I did that on purpose. If you want to look at chapter 2 of James, look at chapter 1 first. And this is what I've done here in the table of contents, and examine it carefully. You jump right to the passage at hand, and you're liable and will misinterpret it. Especially when you think that salvation alone only means working for eternal life. You know, you can work for rewards in heaven, right? That's a salvation, a preservation. You can work toward being safe and out of harm's way. That's a preservation or a salvation of your physical life, the length of your years. Being faithful, you won't let your years be cut short. Okay, so let's look at James 2:14. It's a big, long, here it is. (2:14). What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? And the next question there in this phrase, in the second phrase of this verse, can faith save him? The answer is implied there by the Greek grammar, no. Wow, we already said you have salvation by grace through faith. Remember, it says right here, I just reminded people, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. Of his own will, of God's own will, he brought us forth, gave us birth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of firstfruits of his creatures, i.e., of all he created, with a view to assurance of eternal life. So then you jump into chapter 2 and work through the first 13 verses. You get to, what does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? By the way, they're still brethren even if they have no works. They have faith because we looked in chapter 1 and it says you have salvation by faith through the word, what the gospel is in the word. So, let's just take a look at this. Let's just bounce back. Faith without works is dead into the index. We'll get right to that point. F, faith without works is dead. Faith without works is dead. Faith without works will not save one from early physical death. A believer who does not do what the implanted word says, who does not lay aside all filthiness and abundance of evil as acceptable behavior, wherein sin has become full-grown in him, has no works. Faith without works will not be saved from early physical death. We just read, therefore, having laid aside all filthiness and overflow, abundance of evil, and received with meekness, humble obedience, the implanted word which is able to save your souls, do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves, do what it says. And in verse 2:14, what does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? All right. Now we have in mind salvation can mean a number of things. We looked at the Greek here. Can faith save him is the key phrase here that we're looking at. The faith saver, is it that relative to the goal of having laid aside all filthiness and overflow, abundance of evil, believers must receive with meekness, humble obedience, the implanted word, which is able to save your souls, your lives from premature physical death, is the presumption here that will prove out, toward the end of bringing about the righteous life that God desires. Verse 120, so as to be saved from a premature physical death. 121, the believer is to humbly go to the source of information that provides instruction on this matter, the word of truth, the Bible. To receive with meekness, humble obedience, the implanted word, is not to merely listen to the word without acting upon it. To listen without doing results in deceiving oneself is deceiving oneself that progress towards the righteous life is being made. So you listen, don't be just merely listeners, but do it. But that's not to get your eternal life. That's already done in chapter 1. Believers instead are also to do what it says, because you're already a believer. It says, brethren. If you haven't done enough works to become a brethren, then you wouldn't be called brethren, as it says in these passages. A believer who does not do what the implanted word says, does not lay aside all filthiness and abundance of evil, in other words, sin has become full grown in him, he has no works.